The morning post arrived at Whitehaven Mansions with the usual flourish of envelopes, circulars, and elegant cards. Hercule Poirot, ensconced in the warmth of his breakfast routine, a soft-boiled egg precisely timed and a pot of dark coffee, placed just so eyed the stack with mild disinterest until a pale grey envelope, edged in gold, caught his attention. He examined it with a frown of curiosity. The paper was of an expensive make, the handwriting delicate and practiced. The address M. Hercule Poirot, Whitehaven Mansions, London, was rendered with a distinctly Austrian flourish. Vienna, he murmured to himself. It has been many years. He reached for his letter opener with the precision of a surgeon, slicing the envelope open and withdrawing the contents. A thick card bearing a familiar family crest, 2 lions rampant over a violin and rose, and a letter written in black ink, precise and flowing. My dear M. Poirot, you will no doubt remember my daughter Liselotte and the musical summer we shared at the Schloss Grunwald many years ago. It is with mixed joy and urgency that I write to you now. Liselotte is to be married. The ceremony will take place during the annual Strauss Ball at the Palace School Enborn-Bathiani in Vienna, a most magnificent affair. However, certain omissions, threats, and one inexplicable occurrence have marred the lead-up to the festivities. I trust your discretion and brilliance more than any investigator I have ever known. Will you consider joining us as our guest, and perhaps our quiet guardian? Enclosed are 2 first-class tickets on the Orient Express. Yours in anticipation, Baron Leopold von Reichenbach. Poirot set down the letter and regarded it thoughtfully. The name Baron von Reichenbach stirred memories of a dignified Austrian aristocrat with steel-grey eyes and a fondness for Schubert. And Liselotte, yes, she had been a girl of great promise then, a prodigy at the piano with a tragic melancholy that clung to her like a perfume. He turned the envelope upside down and 2 pristine train tickets fluttered out. Poirot's dark eyes gleamed. An invitation most unusual, he said aloud, and where there is subtlety, there may be danger. He did not have long to reflect before the familiar knock of Captain Hastings sounded at the door. Poirot's old friend entered with the brisk energy of a man freshly back from the countryside. "Morning, Poirot. You wouldn't believe the traffico. What's this?" he said, eyeing the tickets Poirot had just slipped back into the envelope. Poirot extended the letter. "A most curious invitation, and one I believe we shall accept. Mon ami, Vienna." "You mean we're going to Austria?" Poirot nodded. "To a wedding, but one which is perhaps not entirely a celebration." Hastings's brow furrowed. "A wedding with a mystery." "A wedding with you, a petite complication," Poirot corrected delicately, "which may grow, if I am not mistaken, into something altogether more grave." 2 days later, beneath a sky the color of weak tea, Poirot and Hastings stood upon the platform at Victoria Station. The Orient Express gleamed like a polished jewel, its gold lettering proud against deep blue paint, promising luxury, secrecy, and motion. That their compartment, reserved under the name of Reichenbach, was as fine as a Parisian hotel room. Walnut paneling, plush velvet upholstery, and a small brass lamp that glowed with a soft, civilized light. Poirot, ever meticulous, unpacked his dressing case and arrayed his brushes and mustache wax with geometric precision. Hastings, on the other hand, sprawled contentedly by the window, admiring the train's slow roll out of the city and the growing countryside beyond. "Do you think there's really something amiss with this wedding?" Hastings asked after some time. Poirot folded his silk dressing gown carefully. "The Baron is not a man to write dramatic letters. He speaks with restraint, and yet he invites me under the guise of subtle unease. What is more, he mentions omissions and threats. These are not the words of a doting father alone. And the girl, Liselotte, beautiful, gifted, and melancholic. She plays the piano like a ghost searching for her lover. Such souls often attract strange fates." It was in the dining carriage that evening that they encountered the first of the guests. The car was candlelit, the silver glinting with each sway of the train. Hastings, tucking into his veil, noticed the tall man at the far end of the carriage first, a stiff-jawed figure in a black coat who seemed to watch Poirot with veiled interest. "Curious fellow," Hastings whispered. "He's been staring since we entered." Poirot turned only slightly, barely enough to register the man, an officer, or a banker perhaps. "But no, there is the bearing of old service. He is military." "Yes, that is clear." Another couple entered, a woman with flame-red hair and a laugh too loud for such elegant surroundings, and a lean grey man who did not speak even when she teased him. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured. Already, the cast assembles. The following afternoon they arrived in Vienna, greeted by a liveried chauffeur with a sign that read M. Poirot in precise copper plate. Vienna lay in a late winter hush. Frost clung to the statues and domes, and the spires of the city stood like watchmen over its golden past. The car took them past the Rathhaus, the Burgtheater, and the Music Verein, before turning onto a quieter street and stopping before the Hotel Imperial, a grand establishment poised between Baroque opulence and imperial pride. There, standing at the top of the steps, was Baron Leopold von Reichenbach's head, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. He extended a hand. "M. Poirot, it is both a comfort and a relief to see you." "And Captain Hastings," Poirot added warmly. "We are honored, Baron." The Baron inclined his head. "You will have questions." But first rest. You are our guests. The Strauss ball is tomorrow night. All will become clearer then, though I fear the clarity may come at a price." He turned, then paused. "One thing, M. Poirot Lissalot has received a letter, an anonymous one. It arrived 3 days ago and said, quite plainly, do not dance the waltz. Not with him. Not if you value your life." Poirot's eyebrows arched. "I see," he said softly. "Then it has already begun." The grand chandelier of the Palais School-Enborn, Bathiany, gleamed like 100 miniature suns, casting golden reflections on polished marble floors and the rich velvet of Viennese balconies from the balconies above. A string quartet tuned there, instruments with fastidious grace, preparing for the opening notes of the Strauss waltz that would soon fill the domed hall. It was a vision of elegance, a scene snatched from a dream, but one that Poirot, ever sensitive to undercurrents, felt pulsing with tension. From his vantage at the edge of the ballroom, Poirot stood immaculately dressed in a charcoal tailcoat, his white silk cravat starched to perfection, and his patent leather shoes gleaming. Beside him, Captain Hastings adjusted his gloves with the air of a man both impressed and confused. "Good heavens, Poirot," he whispered, leaning in, "have you ever seen such a place? I half expect to turn around and see Emperor Franz Joseph himself walking through the doors." Poirot smiled faintly. "Vienna is a city of appearances, mon ami. Here, beauty often conceals disquiet." At that moment, the Baron appeared. His expression was proud but taut, the mask of an old-world aristocrat protecting a troubled mind. "Ah, M. Poirot, Captain Hastings, you are most welcome. The ball begins in earnest soon. Lissalot is dressing now. When she arrives, you will see for yourselves both her radiance and, I fear, her unease." The Baron led them through the hall to a quieter gallery, where refreshments were being served beneath oil paintings of Reichenbach ancestors. Here, the other guests of note gathered, the red-haired woman from the train, now radiant in green silk and introduced as Madame Célia Valmont, a French operatic soprano. Her silent companion, the gaunt man with hollow cheeks, was named Dr. Johannes Keller, an expert in antique manuscripts, and, apparently, her fiancés. Next came the tall man Hastings had noted earlier, Colonel Ambrose Roth, a British military attaché, once posted in Vienna. Greeted Hastings with a firm handshake and a wary eye turned toward Poirot. "You're the Belgian chap," he said. "The detective." "I am Hercule Poirot." "Yes," replied Poirot, inclining his head. "And you are no longer with His Majesty's army?" Roth's smile did not reach his eyes. "Retired, though I still move in certain circles." "And do those circles often intersect with the affairs of the Reichenbach family?" Poirot asked mildly. Roth chuckled. "That depends, monsieur, on what sort of affairs you mean." Poirot made no reply, but his gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer than courtesy required. Just then, a hush fell over the ballroom. The music paused. All heads turned to the grand staircase, and there, descending slowly in an ivory gown stitched with tiny pearls, was Lissalot von Reichenbach. She looked ethereal, tall, graceful, her long blonde hair swept into a braided crown, her skin pale as fine porcelain, and yet, as she stepped down the stairs and smiled at the crowd, Poirot noted the rigid way her hands clasped the banister, the faint shadow behind her eyes. "Beautiful girl," Hastings murmured, "but she looks like she's seen a ghost." "Nan," Poirot said softly. "Not a ghost, a threat." The music resumed, the first tremulous notes of the Kaiser Waltz. A soft ripple of anticipation passed through the crowd as couples formed on the floor. Lissalot stood alone for a moment, then was approached by a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark emerald tuxedo with an antique brooch at his throat. He bowed low and extended his hand. She hesitated for only the briefest second, then nodded. "Who's that fellow?" Hastings asked. "The fiancé," the Baron answered behind them. "Nicholas Hindel, son of an old industrial family. Handsome, charismatic, well-educated, but—" He trailed off. Poirot turned to him. "But—" The Baron's eyes narrowed. "There are things I do not like. The letters, the secrets. My daughter grows quieter each day." As the waltz began in earnest, Lissalot and Nicholas turned, together in graceful revolutions, but Poirot's sharp eyes fixed on Lissalot's face, her smile too tense, her gaze often darting toward the balconies above. Then it happened, as the pair glided toward the edge of the dance floor. A hush fell again, not one of admiration, but of alarm. Lissalot suddenly stumbled, catching herself on Nicholas's arm. A murmur ran through the crowd. Poirot was already moving by the time he reached her. She had been helped to a chair by a footman. Her hand trembled as she clutched a folded piece of paper, crumpled, torn along one edge. Her face was drained of color. "Lissalot," the Baron cried, hurrying forward. "What is it?" Poirot knelt beside her gently. "Mademoiselle, allow me." She handed him the note, her eyes pleading. It was written in the same ink, same hand, as the Baron's earlier letter, but the message was shorter. "You were warned. He is not what he seems. The next dance will be your last." Back in the Imperial Hotel suite, an hour later, Lissalot sat between her father and a maid, her eyes wide, her voice low. "I didn't see who gave it to me," she whispered. "One moment we were dancing, then I felt something brush my hand. The note was folded into my glove." Poirot turned it over. No seal. The folds were crisp. Someone had planted it moments before. "Had you been warned before this?" asked Liselott hesitated. There were 2 other letters. One came last week by post. It said simply, "The bride must not dance with the deceiver." The other was left in my practice room 3 nights ago. I thought it was a prank, but now you do not suspect Nicholas Hastings asked gently. Liselott's lip quivered. I love him, but I don't know him as well as I thought. Poirot stood, crossing to the window. Vienna's old city sprawled below, gas lamps flickering in the fog. It is not a prank, he said at last. Someone wishes to stop this union, whether to protect you or to protect a secret that we must discover. The Baron nodded. We have 2 days before the ceremony. Will that be enough? Poirot smiled faintly. For the truth, 2 days is an eternity. But for a murderer it may be too long. The morning after the Strauss ball dawned grey and damp. The Viennese sky layered in clouds like folds of melancholy silk. Hercule Poirot sat in the gold-draped breakfast room of the Hotel Imperial, sipping his black coffee with fastidious care, while Captain Hastings, somewhat bleary-eyed, perused the continental breakfast spread with far more enthusiasm than judgment. Ham and sardines. Poirot Hastings muttered, loading his plate. The Austrians have no notion of what makes a proper breakfast. Poirot smiled faintly, dabbing his lips with a starched linen napkin. Mon ami, they understand refinement in many things, but the English concept of a hearty morning repast is not among them. Hastings glanced up. I still can't get over that letter right in the middle of the dance floor. Could have caused a scene. But it did not, Poirot replied, setting down his cup. And that, my friend, is part of what interests me. Whoever delivered that note, they did so subtly, invisibly, in a ballroom full of watchful eyes. They acted unseen. That requires either great skill or perfect distraction. He gestured toward the ornate envelope he had placed on the table beside him. The note, now carefully unfolded, lay pinned open beneath a silver knife. Poirot had been examining the paper for the past hour. No watermark, he murmured, but the ink is of an uncommon viscosity. Hand-mixed, perhaps. The style of writing suggests someone educated but intentionally uneven, as if they wished the script to appear anonymous, and yet certain flourishes remain. The loop, of the Eldon value, the particular pressure on the cross of the T. Hastings gave a mild groan. You're about to say that you can tell who wrote it from a twirl of their pen. Poirot smiled indulgently. Not yet, but we are narrowing the possibilities. At that moment, a knock came at the suite door. The Baron entered, grave and composed, followed closely by Nicholas Hindle. Nicholas looked tired but striking as ever, tall, his dark hair swept back, and dressed in a charcoal morning coat with a silver tie pin in the shape of a laurel leaf. Yet something in his expression was tense, guarded. Good morning, gentlemen, the Baron said, taking a seat. I felt it important you speak with Nicholas at once. Nicholas nodded. I understand you've seen the note. I have, Monsieur Poirot said, gesturing to the paper. A direct threat against your bride-to-be, and curiously timed, don't you think? Placed during the moment of greatest visibility. Nicholas leaned forward, his jaw tight. I want to be clear, I love Liselott. I would never harm her, we said Poirot smoothly. And yet someone wishes to stop the wedding. I must ask, are there any complications? Former lovers, secrets, business rivals? Nicholas hesitated, and a flicker of something passed over his face. Poirot saw it instantly. I was engaged once, he said slowly. Years ago, to a violinist named Adele Hartmann. It ended badly. She was passionate, possessive. I left the country. I've not seen her since. Poirot steepled his fingers. And does she know of your engagement to Mademoiselle von Reichenbach? Nicholas looked away. Possibly we run in similar circles. You received no letters? No threats. Nicholas hesitated again. Nothing I took seriously. The Baron stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. If this woman poses a danger, she must be dealt with. Poirot rose as well. Let us not act hastily, Baron. Sometimes it is not the obvious flame that burns. We must consider all possibilities. Dr. Keller, for instance, and Madame Valmont, the Frenchwoman, Hastings asked. Poirot nodded. She watches everything with the eyes of a cat. Later that afternoon, Poirot and Hastings strolled through the Baroque corridors of the Palais School in Born-Bath-Denis, having secured permission to examine the ballroom once more. The palace's grandeur had faded slightly in the light of day. The glimmering chandeliers, now mere ornaments, the silk drapes drawn back to reveal a graying city beyond. Poirot moved slowly, studying every surface, every angle. He paused beside the dais where the musicians had played there. He said suddenly, pointing to a balcony above the gallery floor. Do you see? Hastings squinted. A gallery. Servants' passage. Perhaps narrow, dark, rarely noticed, yet offering a clear view of the floor, the perfect place for observation or interference. They ascended the side stairs and emerged in a slim, velvet-lined corridor above the main hall. Poirot knelt by the balustrade. Someone was here last night, he said softly. See, the dust has been disturbed. And there an ash mark. Someone smoked a cigarette while watching the dance below. He rose. Someone watched and waited. Back at the hotel that evening, Poirot requested a quiet meeting with Liselott alone. She arrived dressed in a soft blue gown, her face drawn. But composed, please, she said. Tell me if I am in danger. Poirot sat across from her. Mademoiselle, I must ask you something delicate. Were you ever involved in a romantic entanglement? One not sanctioned by your family? Liselot's eyes widened. Yes, but it was years ago. I was 17. He was an older pianist, Hungarian. My father disapproved. He dismissed the man from our staff and forbade me from seeing him. What was his name? She hesitated. Arpod Thomas. Poirot's brows drew together. And has he attempted contact since? Once. A letter. But I never opened it. I burned it. Poirot leaned back. You see, mademoiselle, the past is like the bass line of a waltz. It grounds everything, even when unheard. We must now discover whose melody still haunts your steps. He rose. I have one more question. Yes. Do you trust Nicholas? Liselot's lips parted. I want to. That is not what I asked. She looked away. That night, Poirot took a solitary walk through the Ringstrasse, the grand circular boulevard of Vienna. The gas lamps flickered. The spires of churches loomed like silent sentinels. He paused before a shop window displaying antique musical instruments, among them an old Viennese waltz score. D'Urteau d'Estaing's, the Death Waltz. A coincidence. Poirot frowned out. He whispered aloud to himself. Too many shadows dance behind this waltz, and when they fall still, someone may already be dead. The following morning brought with it a pale sunlight that filtered over the rooftops of Vienna like a sigh. Hercule Poirot, dressed immaculately in dove grey, stood beside a table in the Hotel Imperial's reading salon, delicately arranging his gloves and a folded newspaper beside him. Captain Hastings, somewhat less polished in his tweed jacket and creased trousers, entered bearing 2 envelopes. Post Poirot, he said, offering them over. One of them is from Scotland Yard, just routine, I think, but the other came without a return address. Poirot reached first for the anonymous envelope, his expression sharpening. It was sealed with a common red wax, the impression of which was slightly smudged, likely pressed in haste. He opened it with his silver knife, drew out a small card, and read aloud. You dig in soil that buries danger, monsieur. Let the wedding proceed. Forget the past, or we may find you silent, like the others. Hastings let out a low whistle. That's a threat if ever I've seen one. Poirot tilted his head. Mais oui, quite specific like the others, it says. So, there have been others. That confirms what I suspected. He turned the card over blank. The paper was smooth but faintly marked with a watermark. Poirot held it to the light. Vienna legal stationers, he murmured. Only 3 locations. Ah, but let us not become distracted with errands. There is something more useful this morning. We are to meet someone who remembers Adele Hartmann. Their destination was a modest café on the Leopoldstadt side of the city, the sort of place where time passed gently and the smell of old tobacco lingered in the curtains. The proprietor, a stooped old man named Herr Spielmann, had known Adele and Nicholas when they were both students at the Vienna Conservatory. He poured thick coffee into chipped porcelain cups and eyed Poirot curiously. You come asking questions about the girl, he said. Strange, no one's spoken her name for years. She vanished, Poirot asked. Spielmann nodded. After he broke it off, she went mad for a while. Played late into the night, drank more absinthe than water, cursed his name in every café, then she stopped coming. One day she simply didn't return to her lodgings. Did no one search for her? The landlady said she left a note. Said she was going to Paris. But others said they saw her boarding a steamer down the Danube. Did you believe she meant to do herself harm? Asked Poirot quietly. Blois. Spielmann looked away. I think she wanted him to suffer. Poirot pressed further. Do you know if she had friends? Enemies? Spielmann chuckled darkly. She didn't have friends. She had admirers and rivals. One was Arpod Thomas. He hated Nicholas for winning the position she wanted in the Salzburg quartet. Said Adele deserved it more. Bitter fellow. Smoked cloves. Played like a devil. Is Thomas still in Vienna? Spielmann shrugged. Haven't heard the name in years. Might be dead. Or teaching somewhere. He was the kind to hold grudges. Poirot rose, brushing non-existent lint from his lapel. Merci, Herr Spielmann. You have been most enlightening. Later that afternoon, Poirot returned to the Palais School and Born Bathioni to speak with the palace's steward, a slim, eagle-eyed man named Albrecht who had managed the staff for over 20 years, in a small office just off the main kitchens. Poirot sat across from him while Hastings flipped through the staff records. Tell me, Poirot said, who had access to the ballroom the night before the Strauss ball. Albrecht replied without hesitation. Myself, the lighting technician, 2 maids, and a pianist, a hired accompanist for the rehearsals. A pianist. Poirot leaned forward. What was their name? The steward frowned. He was a last-minute replacement. Said he was referred by the Musikverein. Quiet man. Hungarian, I think. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Do you recall what he looked like? Mid-40s. Limp in the right leg. Smelled of clove cigarettes. Hastings sat up. That sounds like Mas. Poirot stood. We must confirm it, and quickly. The Vienna Conservatory was a short drive away, nestled among avenues of statues and scholars, in a back office crowded with music stands and old concert posters. Poirot and Hastings met with the registrar, a middle-aged woman named Frau. She said after checking a register. Arpod Thomas gave guest lectures here briefly. 3 years ago he left after a dispute with the director. Very temperamental. A genius, some said. Others said he was dangerous. Do you have a forwarding address? Poirot asked. She hesitated. Only a postbox in the 8th district. Poirot took the scrap of paper, slipping it into his pocket. You have been most helpful. That evening Poirot requested a private audience with Nicholas and Lisbelot. The Baron insisted on being present, standing by the fireplace like a sentinel as the lovers sat side by side, visibly strained. Poirot faced Nicholas. Monsieur, I must ask again. Are you absolutely certain? Adele Hartmann is not in Vienna. Nicholas looked up slowly. I don't know. I thought she was gone for good, but now. Lisbelot turned toward him. You mean you suspected? I received a letter last week, he admitted. It was unsigned. It said, the past does not forget. The waltz will not finish until the music ends in blood. I didn't tell you. I didn't want to frighten you. Lisbelot paled. And you thought I wouldn't need to know. I thought it was a joke. A bitter one. Adele always had a flair for drama. Poirot folded his arms. But now the past is no longer theatrical, monsieur. It is encroaching with threats, with presence. If Adele is in Vienna, then she may not be content to simply haunt you. She may intend to strike that night. Poirot sat alone in his room. A violin sonata drifted through the walls from the suite next door, melancholic, aching. He rose, stepped to the door, and opened it slightly. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow disappeared. Swift, silent, he walked to the end and saw nothing. But at his feet, left deliberately, was a torn scrap of sheet music. Toadstones, the Death Waltz. The following day arrived cloaked in a thick, clinging mist that wrapped Vienna in a shroud of pearl-grey silence. The spires of St. Stephen's Cathedral faded into the haze like ghosts, and the great Ringstrasse was muffled under the whispering patter of light rain. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of his suite at the Hotel Imperial, gazing out over the mist-bound city with his hands clasped behind his back. The fragment of sheet music he had discovered the night before now lay on the table behind him, carefully flattened and pinned at the corners with silver teaspoons. Toadstones, he murmured aloud. The Death Waltz. The motif repeats. Captain Hastings, sitting by the hearth with a cup of strong Viennese coffee, looked up. You think it's a signature then? A calling card? Poirot turned. More than that, it is a message, or perhaps a warning, a code of revenge, dressed in culture and sentiment. He approached the table and bent over the music. This is no ordinary waltz. Do you see, Hastings? The time signature here 3/4, yes, but modulated with irregular phrasing, and this, he tapped a handwritten line, is not part of the original Strauss composition. Someone has altered it. You mean the melody maze, and the structure? They have inserted a measure in 5/4 that is unheard of in traditional Viennese form. It creates imbalance, it lurches, just like someone who limps. Hastings said slowly. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Turs bien mon ami. The music limps. Yes, as does Arpa Thomas. He picked up the fragment, folded it precisely, and tucked it into his pocket. Come, we shall visit the district of the postbox. I do not think our Hungarian ghost has fled just yet. The 8th district, Josephstadt, was quieter than the tourist-strewn boulevards of the Ring. Its narrow streets, lined with Art Nouveau facades and cobbled stones, wet with morning rain, exuded a restrained melancholy. They arrived at the postbox address provided by the conservatory, a crumbling apartment building with iron balconies that sagged like wary eyebrows. Poirot and Hastings entered through a heavy wooden door and ascended the stone staircase. The third-floor landing smelled faintly of must and tobacco. A small brass plate read, T.A., nothing more. Poirot knocked. There was a pause. Then, the faint creak of a floorboard. Another knock. At last, the door opened by an inch. A woman stood there. She was not what Hastings had expected. Her hair, once golden, was now tinged with auburn and pinned back severely. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin pale, and her lips drawn. She wore a faded blue dressing gown, and in her left hand a lit clove cigarette curled smoke toward the ceiling. Monsieur Poirot, she said softly. You're late. Poirot inclined his head. You know who I am. You were never difficult to find. She stepped back. Come in. But only you. Hastings frowned. You sure, Poirot? Yes, Hastings. Wait below. Poirot entered. The flat was dim and smelled of burnt coffee and paper. Books and music scores were stacked in tall, uneven towers. A piano sat in the center of the room like a brooding animal. Beside it, a chair, and beside the chair, a cane with a silver tip. I am not Adele Hartmann, the woman said. Turning away, Poirot said nothing. She walked to the piano and laid her hand lightly upon it. I am her sister, Clara. Adele is dead. Poirot's expression did not change, and yet she is everywhere. Clara gave a sharp, bitter laugh. Yes, that is her way. She always made herself unforgettable. He stepped closer. You know what has happened. The letters, the threats, the music. I wrote them, Clara said quietly. Poirot raised an eyebrow. All of them, all but one. Poirot said nothing. Clara turned to him fully now. I wanted to stop the wedding. I had no intention to harm Lisbelot. I wanted Nicholas to know he had not destroyed Adele without consequence. Destroyed. She took her own life. M. Poirot, a bottle of absinthe, and the Danube. The police found her coat. Nothing more, but no body. No, only the river. Poirot's brow furrowed. And yet you are certain she is gone. Clara's fingers clenched the edge of the piano. Yes, I am certain. Adele was not theatrical in her despair. She meant what she did. Poirot took a slow breath. And the final letter, the one placed in Liselotte's glove. Clara shook her head. That was not mine. I had no part in the incident at the ball, nor the music fragment. I left that, but not at your door. Poirot tilted his head. Then someone else follows this melody of revenge. Clara walked to a bookshelf and took down a folder. Inside were scores de Todestunes in varying annotations, some in Adele's hand, others altered. This was hers, Clara said. She composed it. It was never published. She used to say, if I ever disappear, let the waltz speak for me. Poirot looked at the markings. In the margin of one version was a line scribbled hastily in German. A tanzt mit dem Tod aberweis. Is nicht, he dances with death, but does not know it. He closed the folder. Merci, Mademoiselle Hartmann. I believe you have told the truth, but you are not the only one carrying a ghost. As Poirot rejoined Hastings on the street, he remained silent for several moments while Hastings asked, was it her? No, Poirot replied. It was someone else. Someone using Adele's legacy. A ghost, yes, but perhaps not hers. He looked down the street, where the fog rolled in once more. We are being played, Hastings, played like dancers in a waltz choreographed by someone who knows the rhythm of grief and vengeance, and they intend the final step to be fatal. It was late afternoon when Poirot and Hastings returned from Josephstadt, the mist beginning to lift from Vienna's rooftops as church bells chimed solemnly across the city. The sun, dulled by the day's moisture, filtered through the hotel windows, in hesitant rays dart in their suite at the Hotel Imperial. Poirot sat quietly in the drawing room, hands steepled beneath his chin. He had not spoken since their return from Clara Hartmann's apartment. Hastings, seated opposite him and fidgeting with the morning newspaper, finally broke the silence. She admitted to writing the letters. That should be the end of it, shouldn't it? Poirot stirred. Ah, Hastings, you use the word end too freely. Clara Hartmann may have tried to frighten Nicholas, and even Liselotte, but she is not the one whose mind dances with violence. There is another presence, someone unseen, perhaps even unsuspected. Hastings frowned. But why continue the threats after Clara stopped? If Adele's dead and Clara is no murderer who gains from tormenting Liselotte, that is precisely the question. Mon ami. Poirot rose and began to pace slowly across the rug. The threats have evolved. The tone has sharpened. Clara's letters were bitter. Yes, but they carried the sting of grief. The most recent, the one slipped into Liselotte's glove. It was surgical, calculated. And then there is the matter of the inserted musical bar in Der Todesstanz. That was not Clara's hand either. Poirot's eyes flicked to the windowsill, where the sheet music still lay pinned. No, someone else is conducting this affair now. Someone skilled in deception, a mind not just wounded but vengeful, perhaps even delusional. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The Baron's valet stood in the doorway, bowing stiffly. Baron von Reichenbach asks that you join him in the Palais Library at once, monsieur. The library of the Palais School Enborn, Bathiany, was a magnificent chamber. High ceilings, 2 stories of books bound in calfskin and faded linen, and the faint scent of beeswax polish. Heavy velvet drapes were drawn back to let in the watery light, which caught the gold leaf on the cornices like fire in fog. Baron von Reichenbach stood at the hearth, a glass of dark liqueur in one hand. He did not greet Poirot and Hastings immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a tall man seated in the corner, none other than Colonel Ambrose Roth. I thought it was time you spoke to the man who has been watching us all, the Baron said gravely. Poirot turned his attention to Roth, who rose slowly. I admit I have observed you, monsieur, but not without reason. And what reason is that, Colonel? Roth hesitated, then sighed. Because I have been watching over Liselotte. Hastings raised a brow. You know her? Roth gave a short nod. Since she was a child. Her mother, Baroness Anna, was my cousin. When she died, I swore to keep an eye on the girl from a distance. Poirot moved closer. Then why the secrecy? Because of Nicholas Heindel, Roth said coldly. I don't trust him, nor the company he keeps. Did you know, Monsieur Poirot, that Nicholas's family lost a fortune after the war? His father dabbled in unsavory trade arrangements with the Italians. There were rumors, guns, passports, even names. The Baron paled. You never told me this because it could never be proven, and I thought perhaps Nicholas was different. But then the letters began. Poirot's voice was soft. And what did you do, Colonel Roth? I followed Nicholas, spoke to old associates, paid a discreet visit to his former lodgings. Found nothing conclusive, but it's there, a shadow, a lie. Poirot tapped his fingers together. Did you visit the rehearsal night before the ball? Roth hesitated. Yes, briefly. I watched from the musicians' gallery. I wanted to see how Liselotte behaved in his presence. Poirot's eyes lit up. Then you were the one who left the... Roth nodded. A foolish habit. I smoke when I'm tense. You left no message. None. Poirot turned to the Baron. Do you believe him? The Baron gave a curt nod. Ambrose may be overzealous, but he has no reason to harm my daughter. Poirot turned back to Roth. One more question, Colonel. Were you aware that Adele Hartmann composed an unpublished waltz Der Tode Stearns, and that the sheet music is now being used to mark threats? Roth stiffened. I've never heard of it. Poirot's eyes lingered on him, then relaxed. Mercy, that will be all for now. That evening, Poirot walked alone through the Musikverein concert hall, having been granted special access by the director, who held the great detective in quiet awe. The building was empty, its gilded halls silent save for the echo of careful footsteps. He moved through the practice rooms and corridors, until he reached a chamber where Lacelot had rehearsed privately in the days leading up to the ball. Beside the piano, he found what he was looking for. Tucked beneath the music stand was a folded square of paper, no larger than a playing card. He unfolded it carefully. Inside, a drawing, a crude sketch of a faceless woman in a wedding dress, her head bowed. Behind her a figure loomed in shadows. The caption beneath, written in jagged German script, "When sie tanzt, stirbt sie. If she dances, she dies." Poirot's jaw tightened. He did not speak aloud this time. He merely folded the paper, replaced it in his pocket, and turned to leave, his polished shoes tapping softly in time to a rhythm only he could hear. The rhythm of death. The next day broke, brittle and cold, the fog having lifted to reveal a stark clarity over Vienna. The city looked suddenly sharper, its lines more distinct, as if it, too, had grown alert to the presence of something unspoken in its streets. Snow threatened in the iron-grey sky above, though it had not yet begun to fall. Poirot and Hastings sat in the Hotel Imperial's tea-room, though neither was in the mood for tea. The discovery from the Musikverein the night before had left a deep impression, particularly on Poirot, who now held the folded sketch between gloved fingers like a doctor contemplating a pathology. "She is being hunted," Poirot said at last, softly, "but not by the obvious wolves." Hastings stared at the faceless drawing. "I still say Nicolas could be hiding something. The girl Adele, his family's secrets, those would be motive enough for someone. We perhaps—" Poirot's eyes drifted to the window. "But Lacelot is not merely being frightened. She is being stalked with symbolism. That drawing, it is a performance, Hastings. The threats are staged as art, letters, music, costumes of meaning." Hastings frowned. "You think the killer's an artist? Or someone who fancies themselves an artist of vengeance, perhaps?" At that moment a pageboy approached their table. "Monsieur Poirot, there is a visitor for you. A Professor Weiss from the Kunsthistorisches Museum." Poirot nodded. "Send him in." Moments later a tall, thin man entered, shoulders slightly hunched in a way that betrayed long years bent over manuscripts and frames. He wore thick spectacles, and carried a leather folio under his arm. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending a dry hand. "I received your inquiry about unusual private acquisitions involving musical manuscripts. I've brought something curious." He placed the folio on the table, unlatched it, and drew out a photograph, an old one, black and white, with faded corners. It showed a glass display case containing a single object, a violin, but not just any violin. "The Hartmann Weiss," said reverently. "A one-of-a-kind instrument commissioned by Adele's grandfather and played only within the family, rumored to have been used in clandestine concerts during the Nazi occupation." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And where is it now?" "That's just it," Weiss said, opening a second document, a police ledger. 2 months ago, a theft was reported from a private collector in Salzburg. One item taken, the Hartmann violin." Poirot leaned in. "Mon Dieu. And when was it last seen?" 10 days ago, Weiss said. "A violinist named Otto Kirsch claims someone tried to sell him a rare instrument outside the opera house. When he examined it, he swore it was the Hartmann, but the seller vanished before he could confirm." Poirot sat back, processing. "A ghost violin, returned to Vienna, the Der Tode Stearns manuscript, the symbolic threats, all point to the same thread." Weiss adjusted his glasses. "And the rumor is, the violin weeps when played. Cries, you would say, because of a hairline crack in the body. No repair has ever silenced it." "Or perhaps," Poirot murmured, "because the hand that plays it still carries grief." That afternoon Poirot insisted on visiting Nicholas Heindel's private apartment in the 2nd District, a smart, well-furnished place overlooking the Prater. Nicolas received them with cool politeness, though the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. "I didn't expect visitors," he said. Poirot bowed slightly. "And yet we must speak plainly, monsieur. You are not merely a fiancé, you are now a target, whether you know it or not." Nicolas closed the door. "I didn't write the letters." Poirot stepped into the drawing room. "No, but I suspect you know more than you have admitted. For example, this." He produced the drawing from the musikverein.Nicholas paled. "She found it?" he asked. "You knew about it?" Nicolas hesitated. "Yes, I found one just like it, in my dressing room at the opera house. I burned it. I didn't want Lacelot to worry." Hastings crossed his arms. "And you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" Nicolas looked genuinely anguished. "I didn't know what it meant. I thought it was Clara again, or someone else from before." Poirot paced to the bookcase and paused. "You had dealings with Arpad Thomas, did you not?" Nicolas sighed. "Only once. He accused me of stealing Adele's concert position. He said I used my father's influence. He spat on me in the street. That was the last time I saw him." Poirot turned in the Hartmann violin. Nicholas looked confused. I know the story, but I've never seen it. Adele used to speak of it as if it were a living thing. Do you think she is dead? Nicholas hesitated. Yes, but part of me wonders if she would be capable of something like this. She had demons. Poirot studied him for a long time. Merci, monsieur, that'll be all for now. That night Poirot visited the Palais School en Bathioni one last time before the wedding rehearsal. The grand ballroom had been redressed, garlands of white roses, polished marble, and golden chairs aligned like the ranks of a royal audience. Liselotte was seated alone at the piano, playing something soft and mournful, not a rehearsal piece, but a composition of her own. Poirot approached, standing just beside the fallboard. You play with pain, he said. She didn't look at him. I always have, even before the letters. Does music help you understand what words cannot say? She nodded. Sometimes it only deepens the silence. He stepped forward. I must ask, mademoiselle, do you feel watched? She looked up at him now. Every hour. It's as though someone is following the rhythm of my days. I find doors unlocked, candles extinguished. I thought it was my mind at first, but now. Poirot laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. We are close, he said. Closer than they think. He turned to leave, but paused at the exit. And mademoiselle, if you hear a violin crying in the night, do not ignore it. She stared after him, confused. Poirot walked into the dark corridor, the sound of her melody lingering behind him, the violin that wept, the waltz that limped, the faceless bride, all were leading to one final movement, and it would not be an encore. Snow had finally come to Vienna. By dawn, the city lay under a thin white shroud, transforming its imperial facades into a frosted tableau. The Palais School en Bathioni looked particularly splendid, as though carved from sugar, but inside, the air was thick with unease, not from the weather, but from the tightening grip of something that moved behind the scenes, unseen, unspeaking, but ever present. Hercule Poirot arrived at the palace early that morning, impeccably dressed as always, and with a noticeable firmness to his step. Captain Hastings followed close behind, bundled in his greatcoat, clearly less thrilled by the winter weather than his friend was by the crispness of mystery. Inside the grand entrance hall, preparations for the wedding were already underway. Servants moved with clockwork precision. Flowers were delivered in armfuls of white and cream. A harpist in the corner rehearsed quietly while the palace steward Albrecht barked orders with the discipline of a field commander, and yet something felt off. Poirot paused at the foot of the staircase, his eyes narrowing. They are preparing a celebration, mon ami, he said to Hastings, but I smell the ritual of death. You think the killer will strike during the wedding? I think, said Poirot quietly, that the wedding is the curtain. What comes after will be the performance. They were met in the library by the Baron, who looked 10 years older than he had the day before. She is not sleeping, he said, his voice low. She awoke screaming in the night. A violin, she said. We heard nothing. Poirot nodded. The violin is a symbol, but now it becomes an instrument again. They are preparing her for something. Not just terror, transformation. The Baron rubbed his temple. You speak as if this is a play. Poirot turned sharply. Because, monsieur, it is. This entire affair, the letters, the warnings, the music, it is an act of theater. And the only question is whether it ends in tragedy. The rehearsal began at 10. The Palais Ballroom, now arranged as a chapel for the civil ceremony, echoed with footsteps as members of the wedding party took their places. Nicholas, tall and composed in a dove-grey morning coat, stood at the altar platform. Liselotte entered on her father's arm, draped in a rehearsal gown the color of antique lace. Her face was pale, her mouth taut, only her eyes moved constantly, nervously, scanning the guests. Poirot stood at the rear of the room beside Hastings and the Colonel. Ambrose Roth, whose arms were folded as though guarding the entire ceremony. With sheer willpower, the officiant, a cheerful judge with florid cheeks, ran through the lines of the ceremony while the wedding planner fussed about with veils and ribbons. Everything seemed as it should, and yet Poirot's eyes roamed on in the gallery above, where musicians would later play. He noticed a slim man in a dark suit, standing unusually still. He touched Hastings's sleeve. Do you see him? Hastings glanced upward. He doesn't look familiar. Stagehand, non-observe. He does not blink. He watches Liselotte. Not Nicholas, not the ceremony, only her. The man vanished into the shadows before Hastings could say more. Poirot left his place and made his way discreetly up the side stairwell to the gallery, only to find it empty. But on the banister, a small silken fiber clung to the wood. He plucked it with gloved fingers. A violin bow hair, he murmured. He returned to the main floor just as the rehearsal ended. Guests were mingling. The Baron whispered something to Liselotte, who nodded, then moved away down a side corridor. Nicholas turned to speak with the judge. Poirot moved like a shadow through the growing cluster of guests, discreetly following Liselotte's path, through the corridor, past the music room, and into the private winter garden, a glass-domed room filled with exotic plants and warmed by hidden pipes. Liselotte stood alone, her back to him, staring at a fountain. Poirot waited a moment, then softly called her name. She turned. I knew you would follow. You left alone, he said. You are not safe. She nodded faintly. It was happening. Again, that feeling like someone just behind me. Poirot stepped forward. You dreamed of a violin last night. It wasn't a dream, she whispered. I heard it, clear as anything. Playing deux tourtestans. Poirot exhaled slowly. Then we are very close, mademoiselle. She shook her head. It isn't just Adele, is it? No, Poirot said. Someone else is playing the tune. Someone who wishes to be Adele, or become what Adele represented, loss, love, obsession. She turned away. Do you think I'm mad? I think, Poirot said, you are the only one truly awake. That evening, Poirot sent Hastings on a discreet errand to visit Otto Kirsch, the violinist who had nearly purchased the Hartmann violin. The address was in Margareten, a district of cafes and disreputable antiques. Kirsch, a wiry man with anxious eyes, lived above a bakery. He greeted Hastings with suspicion until he heard Poirot's name. I'll speak, but only briefly. He led Hastings inside and showed him an old concert program and a sketch. That's the man, he said, who tried to sell me the violin. Said his name was Wenzel, thin, pale, limp on one leg. Hastings froze. Thomas? Kirsch shrugged. He wore a hat, sunglasses, he had a smell, cloves and turpentine. Did he say where he got the violin? Said it was his sister's, that she'd come back. I thought he was mad. Hastings left 5 minutes later, heart pounding. That night, Poirot studied the sketch by lamplight. The man resembled Thomas, but Poirot saw something more in the pencil lines, the desperate angularity of someone impersonating grief. He stood, walked to the fireplace and made a call. Baron von Reichenbach, I must speak with you privately and quickly. They met in the Baron's study. Poirot got straight to the point. You employed a second pianist for Liselotte's lessons before the Strauss ball, did you not? The Baron blinked. Yes. She insisted on rehearsing privately. I assumed it was nerves. The man's name was Steiner. Poirot nodded grimly. There is no Steiner. That man was Thomas. The Baron stiffened. But he vanished years ago. He has returned, Poirot said softly, and I believe he is preparing a finale. One that does not end in applause. He turned to the window, watching snow fall gently on the courtyard below. This wedding, he said, has become a dress rehearsal. But for what? A killing in costume, a murder in music. Poirot's fingers curled slightly on the windowsill. The final movement begins tomorrow. The morning of the wedding dawned hushed and pale. A thin, brittle snow coated the rooftops of Vienna, muffling the sound of carriages and footsteps alike. The entire city felt paused, breath held, as though aware that something hidden, something vital was about to unfold. Within the towering halls of the Palais School Enborn Bath-Anise servants moved with polished urgency. Fresh garlands were being hung, the altar had been adorned with white lilies, and a quartet was tuning instruments in the musicians' gallery, rehearsing strains of the Blue Danube and de Waltz. There was no trace of deux tourtestans, not in the program, not among the performers, not in anyone's spoken plans. And yet Poirot knew its phantom presence lingered. Hercule Poirot, standing at the edge of the ballroom in full formal dress, crisp white tie, gloves and boot, looked utterly at ease to the casual observer, but his sharp, dark eyes flicked constantly, from the guests gathering near the entrance to the musicians overhead, to the hidden recesses of the chandeliers and balconies. His mind ticked like a metronome. He had not slept earlier that morning. Poirot had received an envelope slipped silently beneath his door. Inside was a single line, typed on a manual typewriter. Today, the music ends. Her silence will be perfect. There was no signature, no date, only that cold promise. Hastings, upon reading it, paled. So it's happening today. Poirot had nodded. Yes, mon ami, we are out of time. Either we stop them now, or we watch them complete their composition in blood. Back in the ballroom, the guests had begun to arrive. Diplomats, artists, aristocrats in fur and satin. Madame Celia Valmont made an entrance in black chiffon for contrast. She said coyly, though Poirot suspected it was something darker. Dr. Keller, ever quiet, remained glued to her side. Nicholas stood by the altar, his face set like marble. Liselotte had not yet emerged. Baron von Reichenbach joined Poirot by the east stair. She's ready, the Baron said, though she barely spoke all morning. Said she had dreamed of rivers. Poirot glanced at him. Then she remembers. Remembers what? Not what was done, Poirot said gravely, but who was watching. The Baron looked puzzled, but Poirot offered no more. At 11 o'clock sharp, the ceremony began. The judge took his place. The string quartet struck up and Der Shannon Blow and Donau, and from the far end of the hall, Liselotte entered alone, trailing a veil of lace and ivory, her expression solemn and unreadable. Every head turned, and above in the gallery a single note rang out. Not part of the waltz, not from a cello or violin, it was from a second violin, one not listed among the performers. A raw, reedy note, played deliberately. Poirot's head snapped upward, and so did Liselotte's. She froze mid-step, her face straining of color. The judge stopped speaking. The quartet faltered another. Note sounded. Today Tanz at the death waltz played. Live. By someone else. Poirot moved instantly, striding toward the side stairway. Hastings, already watching from below, followed without needing to be told. Together they burst through the side door into the narrow musicians' passage. climbing quickly toward the gallery. Halfway up, they heard the bowing continue, off-tempo, halting. The tune was distorted now, uneven, limping like someone who had lost the rhythm or never had it. Poirot reached the top of the stair and pushed open the gallery door, just as the final note broke into a wail. A man stood alone at the far end. He wore a black frock coat. His hair was thin, his shoulders hunched. A limp in his right leg pulled him slightly to the left. In his hands was a violin, cracked, warped, held with reverence. He was weeping as he played up hard to Miss Poirot said softly. The man turned, and Poirot saw at once this was not madness, not theatricality. This was grief transformed into performance in its finale. It was meant to be death. Thomas lowered the bow. They wouldn't let her live, he said. They took her name, her voice, her music. Poirot stepped forward. And now you intend to take Liselotte's life, to make the memory whole again. Thomas's eyes were wild, but clear. I already have. She's taken the wine. She thinks it's for nerves. Poirot froze. Well, the bridal dressing room, Thomas whispered. I left it on the table, next to her bouquet. Just a drop. She's asleep. Then the heart slows. She'll feel nothing. Hastings lunged toward him, but Poirot stopped him with a hand. There's no time, Poirot said. He turned and raced back down the stair, faster than he had moved in years. Hastings was just behind him. They burst into the hallway as a scream rang out. From the bridal room, Poirot threw open the door, and there she was. Liselotte collapsed on the floor, her gown billowing around her like a fallen curtain. A bridesmaid knelt beside her, shouting in German. She fainted. She Poirot reached her, knelt and placed 2 fingers at her throat. A faint pulse. Shallow, slow. Call a doctor, he barked now. 2 hours later, the wedding was cancelled, the judge departed, the quartet was dismissed. Guests, murmuring in confusion, were escorted away by palace staff. The snow fell heavier now, muting the retreating carriages like a blanket over scandal. Poirot stood in the Baron's study with Hastings, the Baron, and Liselotte, now pale but conscious, wrapped in a blanket. The doctor had confirmed. She had ingested a strong sedative. Not enough to kill her, but certainly to drop her into unconsciousness had the dose not been discovered in time. Thomas had been arrested quietly. He had not resisted. The violin, it turned out, was indeed the Hartmann, verified by a crack in the tailpiece and Adèle's initials carved inside the frame. It's over, the Baron said, eyes hollow. But Poirot did not look relieved. No, he said quietly. It is not over. Hastings blinked. What do you mean? Poirot turned to them all. Arpod Thomas did not write the final letter. He did not place the poison wine, he confessed, but only to the violin. He believes he scared Liz enough to drive her into retreat, but someone else used his distraction to deliver the dose. He stepped closer to Liselotte. Your glass, mademoiselle. Did you touch it? She shook her head. No, I only held it. I never sipped. The taste, it smelled floral. Poirot nodded. Someone tried to complete his masterpiece for him. And then he turned to the window. There is still someone here, someone who knows the waltz, someone who wants the bride to die on the day the music ends. He turned back to the room. And that, he said softly, is the person I must now reveal. Evening came early that day, as though the very light in Vienna was recoiling from the events that had unfolded in the palace outside. Snow fell more thickly now, softening the baroque edges of the city with a silence that seemed complicit, as though the very rooftops wished not to witness what came next. In the Hotel Imperial's private salon, Hercule Poirot stood before the hearth, the firelight playing across his polished shoes and casting sharp shadows across his features. Captain Hastings sat nearby, his brow furrowed and his hands clasped tightly. We have the villain, surely, Hastings said for the 3rd time. Thomas was the one who returned. He brought the violin, he wrote the music, he confessed. Poirot, still and sharp as a blade in thought, shook his head. Nan Hastings, he performed, yes, but he did not write the finale. He turned toward the room's mirror and adjusted his tie with delicate precision. Thomas is a man living inside grief. He came to frighten, to haunt, perhaps even to punish, but not to kill. Hastings blinked. He drugged her. No, he believed he had frightened her into withdrawing from the wedding. The drugged wine was not his doing. He did not even know where Liselotte's dressing room was. And this, Hastings, is what tells us the truth. When asked where he left the wine, he said beside the bouquet. Poirot tapped his temple. Yet the bouquet was not in the room. It had not yet been delivered. Hastings stared. So, someone lied to him. No, mon ami, someone used him. Like a second violin, a harmony that masks the melody. He turned suddenly and walked to the writing desk, where a small silver bell stood beside a stack of palace guest invitations. It is time to draw back the curtain. The guests, they are still in Vienna. Most have not yet departed. The Baron has agreed to my request. This evening we host a dinner. A dinner. Poirot smiled. But it was not a warm smile, a finale rehearsal. A gathering of all performers. One last scene before the curtain falls. That evening the guests assembled once more. Not in the ballroom, but in the Reichenbach private dining room. The long table was set with gleaming silver and dark roses. Candles flickered, casting tall shadows that danced on the carved paneling like flickers of doubt. They came, one by one: Nicholas Heindel, pale and solemn; Colonel Roth, grim and coiled with suspicion; Celia Valmont in red velvet, her gaze roving; Dr. Keller silent, with that same unreadable stillness; Baron von Reichenbach, composed but weary; and Liselott, quiet, alert, seated at Poirot's right hand. Even Arpad Tomas was brought in under escort, allowed to sit at the table, closely guarded, his hands trembling slightly. Poirot stood at the head. "I thank you all for coming," he began. "Tonight there will be no toasts, no music, no merriment. This is not a celebration." He looked slowly down the table. "This is an ending." Hastings watched from behind, feeling the tension crackle in the air. Poirot's voice was calm and precise. "A man has returned to Vienna after years of absence. A violin has surfaced. A waltz has haunted a young woman's steps. Letters have been sent. Threats have been whispered. A wedding was nearly ruined, a life nearly taken." He paused. "And yet none of these things happened by chance. Someone among you, Mesdames et Messieurs, used grief like a mask and music like a knife. You attempted to kill Liselott von Reichenbach this morning, but you failed." A collective murmur swept the table. Liselott's hand clenched slightly in her lap. Poirot raised a single finger. "I shall now explain, and you shall all listen." He moved slowly around the table as he spoke. "First, we must understand motive. Arpad Thomas returned to Vienna for reasons of his own: grief, bitterness, obsession. He brought the Hartmann violin. He sent messages, but he lacked precision. His letters were unpolished, his handwriting emotional, his intent theatrical." Poirot turned toward Celia Valmont. "But the last message was typed. The poison was measured. The threats became methodical. Someone took over the production, someone who understood artifice and performance, not as memory, but as control." Celia's painted lips parted. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot smiled. "No, madame. But you did help clarify one detail. When you sang at the opera gala last season, you performed with an accompanist who later vanished from Vienna, a pianist." Dr. Keller looked up sharply. Poirot turned to him. "You, monsieur, a silent man, a scholar of ink and paper, but not only that, a gifted forger, and an amateur composer." Keller's face twitched. "That's absurd," Poirot continued. "You were once Clara Hartmann's pupil. You admired Adele. You resented her death, but more than that, you envied her." He reached into his pocket and drew out the altered score of Deux Tours de Stance. "You added this measure," he said softly, "a bar in 5/4 time. It is yours, a signature. The same rhythm you used in your thesis on transgressive counterpoint. I had it brought from the conservatory archive this morning." Keller's face drained of color. "You infiltrated Liselott's life as a rehearsal coach under a false name. You replaced her wine with sedative. You allowed Thomas to serve as the mask while you conducted the rest from behind the curtain." A heavy silence fell. Then Liselott stood. "You," she whispered, "but you barely spoke to me. I thought you were Velmont's fiancé." Poirot nodded. "He never was. He used Velmont's name to gain proximity, but his plan was far more elegant. He wanted a performance, a murderer's music, a final flawless waltz." Keller suddenly bolted upward. The guards moved, but he did not run. He only stared at Poirot, breathing hard. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It was hers. The music, the waltz, it had to end. She was playing wrong, like they all do." Poirot stepped forward. "You killed Adele, didn't you?" Keller didn't answer, but he did not deny it. "She wanted to leave," he whispered, "to go to Paris with Nicolas, but she should have stayed. She was unfinished." Guards seized him then. As he was dragged away, he muttered again and again, "She never understood the final movement. Never." Later that night, the dining room empty. Poirot stood alone at the grand piano in the ballroom. He touched the keys softly. One note. Then three, a phrase from the death waltz, but altered, corrected, complete. Liselotte entered behind him, her footsteps echoing. "Will it always be with me?" she asked. Poirot turned the melody. "Perhaps, but now it has no power." She smiled faintly. "You were right. It wasn't grief. It was control." Poirot nodded. "And control dressed in mourning is still tyranny." She stepped forward, rested a hand on the keys. "I will play again, but not this." "No," Poirot said gently. "You will play what you choose, not what the dead demand." The snow still fell on Vienna, but by morning it was lighter, less an omen, more a farewell. The crisp sunlight filtered through the high windows of the Hotel Imperial, turning the white-covered rooftops into glittering domes. A city that had held its breath for so long now exhaled in the corner salon of the hotel. Hercule Poirot sat beside a crackling fire, the gleam of winter catching the gold on his pocket watch chain. He was dressed for travel. Grey suit, dark overcoat neatly folded on the arm of his chair, gloves resting beside his cup of black coffee. Captain Hastings stood at the window looking out toward the fog-laced street. "Well, it's over, isn't it?" Hastings said. "I still can't quite believe it." Keller of all people. He hardly spoke a word. Poirot nodded without looking up. "Yes, it is often the quiet ones who speak the loudest. Not with words, but with actions or with music." Hastings turned and poured a salad. "What will become of her now?" Poirot took a slow sip. "She will recover. I believe she is stronger than even she knows. She has seen the architecture of obsession, and survived it. The wedding will not take place, but I suspect she is no longer heartbroken by that. You mean she doesn't love Nicholas? Poirot shrugged delicately. Love fades when fear takes its place. Perhaps she loved a vision, an idea, but what she saw this week was the shadow behind the waltz, and that changes everything. Hastings folded his arms. You were certain, weren't you? Even before Keller confessed. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Certain, non mon ami. Not until the end, but I suspected. Keller was always watching, not like Roth, with suspicion, or like Thomas with bitterness, but with hunger. He watched Liselott not as a person, but as a role, something to be played to its conclusion like Adele. And he killed Adele. Poirot set his cup down. Yes, I believe he followed her that night. Perhaps he offered to help her leave. Perhaps she confided in him. And when she changed her mind about Nicholas, when she decided to escape instead of fight, he felt betrayed. She stepped off the stage before the performance had ended. So he ended it for her. He paused, then added softly, her body was never recovered, but I believe Keller made sure she would not return. Hastings was silent for a long moment. The violin. Poirot nodded. That was the final flourish. A stolen relic, a cracked voice, but he believed it belonged in his hands. To him, it was justice. Later that morning, Poirot made one final visit to the Palace School in Born-Bathioni. The grand hall was nearly empty now, stripped of its wedding garlands and returned to its imperial stillness. Servants moved quietly, clearing away remnants of a celebration that had never occurred. Liselott was in the winter garden, seated at the same fountain where Poirot had found her once before. She wore a simple wool coat, her hair pulled back, her eyes focused not on the snow outside but on the pond's slow-moving surface. Thank you, she said softly as Poirot approached. He inclined his head. There is nothing to thank me for, mademoiselle. I only followed the music. You survived it. She smiled faintly. Do you know what I'm thinking? Something poetic, I imagine. She laughed gently. I'm thinking, I don't want to be anyone's muse anymore. Poirot's expression warmed. That is wise. She looked up at him. Will you stay in Vienna for a while? I am tempted, but no. There are always more puzzles, more little gray cells to exercise. She stood, then promised me one thing. Anything. Don't forget me. He reached out and clasped her hand gently. Mademoiselle, he said. The dancer who survived the death. Waltz. She is not so easily forgotten. That evening Poirot and Hastings boarded the Orient Express at Westbahn. As the train pulled from the station, Hastings leaned back in his seat and gave a sigh. Vienna, he murmured. What a city. Poirot folded his arms, content at last. Yes, mon ami, a city of waltzes and whispers, but also of ghosts, some real, some imagined, and some wearing very polite shoes. They both chuckled. Poirot looked out the window as the snow began again, soft, silent, indifferent to the wickedness it had witnessed, and somewhere in Vienna, in a forgotten rehearsal room, the echo of a cracked violin faded into silence. The Orient Express moved like a whisper through the snow-covered Alps, the rhythmic clatter of the rails like the faint echo of a waltz long finished. The dining car was nearly empty as Poirot sat with his notebook, gloved hands folded across the cover, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, or perhaps on everything. Captain Hastings stirred his tea thoughtfully across the table. Funny thing, he said at last. I keep thinking about Keller, about how carefully he orchestrated everything. And yet he failed. Poirot looked up with a faint smile. Ah, but that is the nature of evil dressed in genius, mon ami. It always overlooks one thing. Was that the human heart? Poirot leaned back. Liselott's courage, Clara's remorse, even Thomas's regret. They were not notes Keller could read. He understood structure, not soul. Hastings looked out the window. Still, do you think there'll be another like him somewhere? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a small slip of paper from his pocket. The original letter that had summoned him to Vienna. Don't dance the waltz. Not with him. Not if you value your life. He turned it over in his hand before sliding it back into the envelope. There is always another, Poirot said quietly. But we are not helpless. Hastings glanced at him. No. Poirot's gaze was steady. Have logic, observation, and decency. In Vienna, the Palace School in Born-Bathioni stood once again as a monument of stillness. The snow had stopped. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, and within the music room Liselott sat alone at the piano. No audience, no flowers, no veil. Only sheet music, her own, rested before her. She placed her fingers to the keys and began to play. The notes were simple, unadorned, not part of any known composition. A melody of hope, tentative and private but alive. The ghost waltz was gone. A new piece had begun. The truth, Miss Amos, is not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it is a single, sustained note, trembling, unresolved, until one sees what does not fit, and then it stops, and all becomes clear. Hercule Poirot, Whitehaven Mansions, London. 1 month later, Hercule Poirot sat once more in the quiet order of his flat, surrounded by the familiar comforts of his life. The Art Deco clock ticking precisely on the mantel, the symmetry of armchairs, set equidistant from the hearth, and a newly arrived parcel from Vienna, unopened and resting beside a letter bearing the crest of Baron von Reichenbach. He had refused all interviews, ignored all press inquiries. The Courier Zeitung and Die Press had written pages of speculation. The waltz killer, they called Keller. The violin ghost, another headline read. But Poirot had no interest in myth. He was interested in truth, and, in truth, the case had unsettled him more than most. Hastings, who had just returned from a brief trip to Sussex, leaned forward eagerly as Poirot cut the thick string from the parcel and opened the wrapping. Inside was a slim box. Beneath the lid, laid across a bed of velvet, was a piece of sheet music, handwritten, elegant, with a note from La Salotte attached. For you, Monsieur Poirot, the first composition I have ever written without fear. No death, no shadows, just music. Beneath the title in her handwriting, The Waltz After Silence. Poirot smiled faintly. You know, Hastings said, you never did explain, not fully. How did you know it was Keller? Poirot glanced toward the fire. It was his silence. His silence. Yes, a silence to measured. He was always where he needed to be, but never too near. He offered help but never touched the girl. His engagement to Madame Belmont, a fiction, with no paper or church record to support it. And most telling, he left no fingerprints on any glass ever. He wore gloves, always, except once. Poirot stood and walked to his desk. Do you recall the afternoon La Salotte fainted? Yes. Of course, the wineglass was clean, but there was another glass, the bridesmaid's, which had been handled by someone unseen. When I asked for tea to be served, I requested all the glasses be retained, and only one bore the faintest smudge of chamomile oil, and traces of scopolamine. He held up a small file. Keller's print matched. Hastings shook his head. But the violin, the forgeries, the way he mimicked Thomas's obsession. Poirot nodded. Genius, yes, but even genius trips when pride is involved. He inserted his own musical signature into Adele's composition, a measure in 5/4. That was vanity, and the violin. Poirot smiled slightly. He could not resist owning it. He needed to feel that her voice, her past, her soul, belonged to him. Poirot grew quiet, then said softly, that, Hastings, is the most dangerous kind of mind, not the one that kills in rage, but the one that kills in design. Later that evening, after Hastings had gone, Poirot remained in his chair long after. The fire had turned to embers. He held the sheet music from La Salotte once more, and glanced over the first few bars. They were imperfect, beautiful, yes, but hesitant, lacking a certain symmetry. He smiled because for the first time she had written without fear of being watched, judged, or directed. She had written her own melody. He turned to his notebook and jotted down a final reflection in Vienna. I saw death in disguise, but I also saw survival, not the kind of survival that defies bullets or poison, but the subtler sort, the choice to live after fear. It is not a grand thing. It does not waltz, but it endures. Poirot closed the notebook, and for the first time, in many cases, he did not polish his shoes before bed. He simply let them rest, imperfectly aligned. The theater lights of Vienna's Josephstadt flickered in the fog as though uncertain of their own glow. In the days since the arrest of Dr. Keller, life in the city had resumed its rhythm. Operas reopened, orchestras rehearsed, and the Palais School and Born Bathioni stood quiet once more. Its gilded doors closed against winter. And yet, in one final act, barely noticed by the world, the last ghost of the death waltz had not yet bowed. It began with a letter. Poirot received it at Whitehaven Mansions 10 days after his return to London. The envelope was unremarkable. No crest, no handwriting, only a typed address and a Vienna postmark. Inside was a single sheet. He was not alone. She danced too. That was all. No signature, no date, no context. But Poirot knew. He knew, before he even finished reading it. 3 days later, Poirot stood once again before the Palais School en Born Bathioni, invited unofficially by the Baron, who had reopened the estate for a private inquiry. The police had dismissed the note as the rambling of a crank, but Poirot, he had learned to fear the words that followed silence. Baron von Reichenbach greeted him in the entrance hall. You think the letter is genuine? I think, Poirot said carefully, that it was meant for me and no one else. Inside the former bridal dressing room, the scene remained undisturbed. A table, a settee, a glass vase, long since emptied of flowers. Poirot moved slowly, his gaze sweeping over the wallpaper, the floorboards, the baseboards, and there near the skirting, just beneath the window, a faint streak of crimson. Blood? The Baron asked. No, Poirot said softly. Lipstick. Smudged. He stood and faced the far wall. There, in the gilded mirror, was a message invisible to the naked eye, but now faintly visible in the right light. Letters scrawled with a finger in moisture or powder. He traced them aloud. She watched. That evening, Poirot paid an unannounced visit to Madame Celia Valmont. She received him in a salon rich with perfume and crushed velvet, her usual flamboyance tempered by the candlelight. I thought the mystery was solved, she said, swirling a glass of liqueur. The principle is caught, Poirot agreed. But the duet, I am not so certain. Her eyes narrowed. You think Keller had help? I think Keller could not have accessed the Palais alone. He knew too much. He had precise knowledge of the staff, the guest lists, Liselotte's rehearsals. Someone walked him through the steps. Celia's painted lips smiled faintly. "You're looking at me now." "You were never engaged to him," Poirot said quietly. "You never introduced him to anyone before Vienna, but you gave him your name. He asked to use it." Poirot nodded. "And you allowed it. Why?" She paused, then said, without flinching, "Because I owed him." Poirot said nothing. Celia continued. "My sister Sophie, she was in love with Adele Hartmann. They studied together, but Adele cast her aside when Nicolas entered her life. Sophie did not survive that." Her voice remained steady, but the glass in her hand trembled. "She took her life in Salzburg, 1939, the same summer Adele made her debut. That's when Keller came to me. Said Adele had destroyed more than one life. Said the whole world thought her a genius, but never knew what she left behind." Poirot nodded once. "You helped him access the police?" "Yes. I did not know he would try to kill. I thought perhaps he'd frighten the girl. Sabotage the wedding. I didn't know about the drugged wine until after." "You could have stopped him." "I thought about it," Celia said, "and I didn't." Poirot studied her face, and now she stood and walked to the window. Outside, snow drifted like ash. "I live in a theatre, Monsieur Poirot. We all perform our tragedies, some with arias, some with silence." Poirot rose. "You will receive a visit from the authorities, not because you killed, but because you stood behind the curtain while someone else did. And that, madame, is not art. That is complicity." A week later, in a quiet courtroom in Vienna's inner city district, Madame Celia Valmont gave testimony. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, her reputation was ruined. Her career ended, but her sentence was to live with her own role in the final act. Arpad 2 Miss 2 was tried for trespassing, for psychological harassment, for stolen property, but not for murder. Even he had been a pawn. And as for Dr. Keller, he never spoke again. He was declared mentally unfit to stand trial. He spent his days in a sanitarium on the outskirts of Graz, playing fragments of waltzes to an audience of no one. Back in London, Poirot reflected on the case one final time. He wrote no formal report. He gave no lecture. He added only a small note to his private files. The death waltz was not a single melody, but a fugue, multiple voices moving together, echoing loss and madness. And as always, there was a conductor. But the audience, we must ask ourselves whether we applauded too long. Somewhere, in a quiet music room, Liselotte von Reichenbach played again, but now, when she reached the third measure, she paused, tore it out and wrote a new one that limped no longer. The season turned, and with it, Vienna began to breathe anew. Snowmelt trickled down the grand facades of the city's imperial buildings. The Danube, ice-fringed for weeks, once again flowed with quiet authority. Spring had not yet arrived, but something like hope lingered in the air, tentative, like a pianist placing her fingers on unfamiliar keys. But for Hercule Poirot, closure had never been about seasons. It resided in something far rarer. Harmony. Poirot returned to Vienna one final time, officially. His reason was an invitation, a chamber recital at the Musikverein featuring a young composer named Liselotte von Reichenbach. Unofficially, it was something else, an instinct, a sense of unfinished notes, of coda not yet played. He arrived discreetly, avoiding public attention, and settled into a seat near the back of the hall. The performance hall was smaller than the Grand Golden one, more intimate, more human. The walls were lined in warm wood. There was no velvet curtain, no just music and silence. Liselotte appeared on stage in a simple black dress, no longer the haunted girl of the Palais School en Bon Bathioni. Her movements were calm, unhurried, elegant. She sat at the piano, and for a moment her fingers hovered. Poirot leaned slightly forward. Then she began to play. The piece was hers, not Dirt or Destins, not any borrowed waltz, but something quiet, full of pauses, a melody that rose and dipped like thought. It danced briefly, but never spun. It moved forward, a solitary walk through fog toward the faintest light. Poirot closed his eyes. He felt each note. There was a bar, the fifth, written deliberately in 3/4 time, but stretched, extended by a single beat, and then resolved into quiet. It was Liselotte's answer to the corrupted 5/4 measure Keller had inserted into Adele's waltz. She had taken the aberration and softened it, healed it. It was, Poirot thought, the most elegant justice he had ever seen. When the final note faded into stillness, the audience did not clap at once. There was a beat, a breath, then applause. Poirot remained seated as the crowd stood around him. He observed her face, no smile, no flourish. She bowed modestly, then walked off stage. She did not return for a second bow. She did not need to. After the recital, Poirot declined a reception. He walked instead through the city alone. The night was cold, but not unkind. He wandered down narrow alleys until he reached a familiar café in Lyon, the same one where Herr Spielmann had once spoken of Adele, of absinthe, of vanishing women and grieving men. The café was closed now. A sign in the window read "Verkauft, sold." Poirot stood in front of it for several minutes. Then he lit a match and held it to the edge of a folded note, the final anonymous message he had received weeks ago. She danced, too. He let the flame catch. The paper curled, blackened, and fell in fragments to the cobblestones. Ashes, bokkens, gone. Back at his hotel, Poirot prepared his final report, not for the police, not for Scotland Yard, but for himself. In the small leather-bound journal he used for only the most significant cases, he wrote, Vienna case file, the death waltz, motive, obsession, control, identity, victims, Adele Hartmann, deceased, Liselott von Reichenbach, survivor, instruments of crime, violin, music, memory, accomplice, Madame Celia Valmont, complicit in deception, executor, Dr. Felix Keller, institutionalized, pawns, Arpod, Thomas, misguided grief resolution, interrupted, wedding, attempted murder by sedative, musical forgery, psychological orchestration. Music may soothe the savage heart, but twisted, becomes a weapon more insidious than the knife. Final verdict, the melody has ended. The silence, finally, is honest. He closed the journal and set it beside his lamp. In the silence of the hotel suite he stood before the mirror and regarded himself. His tie was slightly crooked. He straightened it and smiled, not out of pride, but because in the distance, faintly, just on the edge of hearing, someone was playing again, and this time they were not being watched.